and now I'm looking forward to some more. So first we will hear from Jacqui Doyle from Ireland. The title of her presentation is Co-creating Tourism Experiences through Interpretive Storytelling. Now, we've heard a lot about storytelling and story sharing, and this co-creating and co-creating in storytelling. Maybe this is some combination of story sharing. So Jacqui will tell us about this. Her presentation is pre-recorded, so she will not appear on screen until later. But you can write your questions and comments in the chat box, and we will discuss them after the presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacqui Doyle.
So we're trying to solve this technical problem. I'm told that it should be in a minute or two, so please be patient just for a couple of minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Jacqui Doyle and I work at the School of Tourism at the Technological University of Dublin. Today I want to share with you some insights into co-creation tourism experiences through interpretive storytelling. The power of storytelling in tourism has been talked about, but it hasn't been empirically researched in an Irish context. A good story has the power to inspire, to energize, and to move people. Good stories build understanding, they convey meaning, they entertain, they teach, they humanize, and they give us the big picture. From Aesop's fables to the Bible, and as young children, we have been interested in hearing stories and telling stories. It's how we communicate. We are listening and telling stories before we can even read and write. We dream in narrative. We daydream in narrative. Everything's a story. We remember, we anticipate, we hope, we despair, we believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative. Stories are part of who we are. They're part of our DNA. And we are all natural storytellers. In Ireland, part of the national policy was to break the country up into different regions. And one region that we decided upon was the east of the island and called Ireland's Ancient East. The basis of Ireland's Ancient East is 5,000 years of history and conveyed through storytelling. Now, when this was first brought about in 2015, while there was some research available on storytelling and tourism, nothing had been done in Ireland. So I set about trying to uncover what happens with tours, with stories in tourism, and is it really a good way to communicate with our tourists and share our culture, heritage, and history. So I'm going to share some of the insights from this research and other research I've done with regard to Ireland's Ancient East. My research took place at a historic house, actually a castle. And as castles go, it's not the biggest one available, but it has a great history. It's called Huntington Castle, and it's in Donegal in County Carlow in the southeast of Ireland. It's a family home. It's been in the same family for generations, for centuries. And therefore, a lot of the history and artifacts are still there and ready to be used for the tourist. My research is based on service dominant logic, which is co-creation. And that's where the guide and tourist come together, and the guide brings their story and interpretation and performance, and the tourist brings their own knowledge and experience. And together they integrate these resources. And so it's like the guide tells the story, the tourist looks at or uses what they already know, and sometimes they create a totally different story based on what the guide has told them and what they have already known. And this is resource integration. So after this integration takes place in the storyscape, the scentscape. This is the surroundings where the tour is taking place, and it engenders engagement and immersion, and it affects the emotional, cognitive, and social states of the tourist. And this is the co-creation, the storied experience co-creation, and results in pleasure. So let me share some of the insights from this research. Okay. At the performance of the guide, and if tourists are involved, their performance as well. We're looking at the process. How does it all happen? How does it come together? We're looking at the perspective of the tourist and how they use their imagination to become immersed and often transported to a liminal place, how they use empathy, nostalgia, how the emotion comes into play. And then pleasure, how pleasure is acquired during this particular tourism event. Place, it's an integral provider operant resource. That is the authenticity of the building and its material culture, what's within the building, set the stage or become the storyscape for the human and object interaction. Some comments was, I thought it was splendid, a real Irish castle that was not contrived for the tourists, their home, and they said, come in and have a look. It is real, it is old, it is modern. Above all, it is authentic. This is the real McCoy. So authenticity in Huntington Castle were the family photos on the piano of a recent wedding, combined with the portraits on the wall of ancestors. The authenticity was a stereo system in the dining or living room. Again, sitting nicely and neatly within the very old storyscape of the tapestries and the art, etc. In the kitchens, we saw Victorian washing machines and one of the very first hoovers. But also in the kitchen was a blender. So it was the authenticity of this was a home that respected the past, but also was lived in now and hopefully into the future. People, what we found here is both actors have a role to play and actively participate in the co-creation process. The guides use their communication skills and physical props of the objects within the house and use them for connecting and relating with the tourist. The tourist said, oh, I wasn't doing anything really, only listening, but they were processing what he was saying and following the stories. So in order for co-creation to take place, the guides and tourists must be actively involved. The stories become the platform of engagement by stimulating interaction between the people, the guide and tourists, and thereby connecting the place and the people in an authentic and memorable way. The guide assimilates elements of the storyscape into the storytelling through the actions of interpretation and communication. It felt very authentic, and you felt privileged to be there with Harry and listen to all his tales. That was one comment. His family home, because there is slightly a different tone to what he's saying and how he says it, rather than if it was a tour guide. The owner is always nice and rare to meet the owner. So the performance and the person here is very important. So what we found was that the interactive encounters are mutually constructive process where the guide's actions inspire and enable the tourist reactions. This is a very old shield, military shield. And in delivering the tour, people were offered to try it on, to feel the weight of it, and explained how it was used as a protective body armor. So the guide, their enabling action was to demonstrate with the prop, to reveal what it is, to generate involvement by asking them, do they want to try it on, by verbal interaction, commenting with the tourist, physical interaction by feeling, touching the armor, humor, cracking a joke and making it feel lighthearted, explaining
choreographing, that is taking them through from this type of armor to the next type of armor, relating it. One of the things they do is they say that the armor was very expensive and it would probably equate to the cost of a 3 Series BMW. People can relate to that, within their own lives, connecting it with the house, with the history, with the local history, and answering questions. The reactions that it enabled were the tourists gave attention. They were listening. They were actively listening. It was visual. We did observations, and it was obvious through their facial expressions. They are focused. They show delight and happiness. They verbal interaction, asking questions and saying, "Oh, that's very heavy," or whatever, just to get them involved. They watch with anticipation of what's coming next. There's laughter, there's movement, and there's conversation with other people in the group, touching, feeling, using the senses, and questioning. The perspective, the guides personally engage the tourists on a physical, sensorial, cognitive, and emotional level. Now, this is very hard to do, to bring all of those things into short vignettes throughout a tour. Through cognitive and intellectual interconnection with the story, tourists integrate their prior knowledge to acquire new knowledge and learning, while simultaneously activating the imagination and engendering a emotive response. So by engaging them with the physical objects, with the senses, with their intellect, adding something new, giving them some learning, and an emotional level also, by relating to it as individuals, we can engender that emotive response and activate the imaginations. Some of the comments people made were, I think as soon as you're in the house, you feel that you're in that period. As you went through different rooms, you got a different sense of what it would have been like. Another, I was totally engrossed, enthralled by it all, kept imagining what it was like, and the paintings of the women let you really see what they looked like. Lovely ladies, only thinking as she told us their stories. You could nearly imagine yourself in their gear, walking up and down the steps, wondering what it must have been like at that time. So think of the words there: engrossed, enthralled, imagining. Yeah, you felt you were in the period. You can imagine yourself in her clothes. These are the things that, and the feelings that lead us to the desired state of immersion or liminality. Tourists described their visit to Huntington as they loved it, they enjoyed it, it was fabulous, fascinating, delightful, incredible, splendid, spectacular, interesting, enthralling, amazing, knowledgeable and excellent guides, extremely enjoyable learning experience, an authentic Irish castle, rare and real history, unusual and interesting antiques. The tour was as good as you'll get, one of the best and worth a visit. Now, this is the ultimate that most of us would like to have written about us after a tour. But this is a tour that has developed over time, and great thought and planning and research has gone in to finding the stories and using the material culture of the castle and its contents to create this loved and enjoyed experience. So the process of appropriation of pleasure are influenced by the authenticity of the guides, the storyscape, the cognitive process of imagination and immersion, and the responses of empathy and personal reflection. So that's bringing it all together to create pleasure. Pleasure isn't something that is experienced right throughout any tourist experience. There are moments of pleasure, and the more moments or episodes of pleasure add up to people making a response that they loved and enjoyed, and it was interesting and enthralling. Okay, I think we've gone through that one. Value or pleasure is accumulated from these episodic story-based interactions and determined by the tourist through post-experience reflection. It is after the tour that they will decide whether they got value or pleasure. The basis of service dominant logic is that pleasure is determined by the consumer. And so what we're looking for is post-experience reflection that says, overall, this was a good tour. So that's the academic side of it and what we've come up with there. But some insights from the research on a practical basis. Okay, what is a story? They come in all shapes and sizes: fairy tales, fables, legends, etc. Well, we have divided this into 6 different types of stories. And the first one is imparting. This is where we give the contextual or background information. Invoking, making reference or connection with other well-known stories, linking people and place. Illuminating, that is giving further information, the transfer of knowledge, explaining how things work and their uses. Insightful, providing understanding by revealing meaning and provoking thought. Inspiring, relating personally and emotionally or cognitively. And immersive, capturing the imagination and facilitating immersion. Okay, so out of these 6, it is a progression. Okay, and some stories will be factual and just giving context to information, and others may be inspiring or immersive. But we have to have a balance of these type of stories throughout our tour. Why do we use stories in tourism? Stories are told at tourist attractions, are used to educate and entertain. They touch people intellectually, physically, and emotionally, and spiritually, and aid their understanding of the destination's heritage. They allow us to extract a personally relevant meaning and derive value from the experience. That is, it touches me as an individual. They have the power to immerse tourists in intense moments and transport them to a special world or liminal place. That is, they get lost in the story. The personal meaning derived from the interaction is what determines value, which is personally relevant. A positive value equals a positive experience. So visitor-friendly interpretation. Well, you're all familiar with Tilden and how he asked us to provoke, relate, and reveal. And to do this by illustrative media rather than simply communicate factual information. Our illustrative medium is storytelling. Information is not interpretation. Interpretation is revelation based on information. They're entirely different things. All interpretation, however, includes information. So we've got to get good information from reliable sources before we start. So how do we put our stories together? So we start with story sourcing. Sourcing and selecting the theme and stories from the historical narrative. What have we to tell and what are we going to tell? What would we like to tell? So looking through our archives and through our history annals and finding the types of stories, the themes. The second step is authoring, creating a coherent structure with a beginning, middle, and end, characters and plot lines. The third step is anchoring the story in the place and the people and the available artifacts. What have we got to use? How does the story relate to the historiography of the building or place? The next step is choreographing. That is mapping the physical storytelling process within the site. What stories are you going to tell? Where are you going to tell them? And creating your tour that has a logical and balanced approach. And then story performing. Perform the interpretive story to educate and entertain and engage your visitors. Okay, so that's an overall plan. So let me use this building as an example. This is a workhouse about 10 miles from Huntington Castle in Enniscorthy, County Wexford. It was built in 1842, which was 5 years before the Great Famine in Ireland. During the famine, these workhouses were cold, miserable places where there was no food, and people often went there just to die. And if I tell you that story, it is very bland, very boring, and there's no connection. There's no person or, the stories of the people who went there, who were in this workhouse. So to find those stories, we need to do research. We need to source the stories. We need to author the stories, write them up. So how do we do this? Well, the best thing that's ever come out is the internet. Okay, so in doing the research locally and online, we can find out about the people who were in this workhouse. And one of the best stories is the story of, what's her name? Alice Sweeney. Alice Sweeney came to this workhouse as a young teenager. And one of the things that was going on at the time was enforced immigration to Australia and to Canada, and young female inmates of the house were forced to emigrate. In her case, it was for Australia. So the local council at the time arranged for the outfits and the transmission of the emigrants to Australia. This young girl who probably couldn't read or write, well, definitely couldn't read and write because we know that, it's listed here, probably only spoke Irish, was given new clothes, new shoes, and a bonnet, and a box, a strong box for her things to go into, and was shipped or transported up to Dublin and went to Liverpool and then across the globe to Australia. We know that, and we can create this lovely story around it because we have John Kinsella made the boxes, Mr. Nangan made the shoes, Mary Whitty paid for the bonnets, we know what they cost. So we know something of her journey out of Ireland. Then if we take the internet across the globe and we go to the records held in Australia, we find a photograph of her. when she arrived in Port Phillip on the 9th of April, 1849. We find her with her first husband here on her wedding day in 1857. We know that when she arrived in Australia, she couldn't read or write. She was employed as a house servant. Then she got married and had one child. Then she had another relationship and had two children. She lived on a sheep station. She married this man, Rutledge, and had 8 children. He died and she married another man. In 1906, Alice was arrested for having no visible means of support and sentenced to 4 years light labour in Armadale jail, where she died a month later on the 11th of November, 1906. So there is a huge story that can be put together with all the elements of emotion and interest and human interest. So heritage storytelling is the presentation of history in tourism. It informs and educates the tourist of the context, the history, whilst also positioning the individual story in that context. That is the heritage. Tourists can relate to and remember the plight of another person more readily than a mere list of facts, that something happened and dates and times. And often the history, the stuff of history books that we learned at school, we want to hear about the people. How to structure the story. Each story must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The introduction then sets the scene, the people and place. Rising action is the main body, the events that propel the story. The climax is the most important point of the story. The falling action, what happens afterwards. Evaluation, the point or reason of the story is told, and the life links, linking the narrative to everyday life. And that's the 5 sections there. Okay, in Huntington Castle, this is a high chair. It's a very old high chair, and the story told around this high chair takes us through these 6 different stages of telling the story. So in the introduction, the guide says, here is an example of an early Irish oak high chair. This belonged to a gentleman called Edward King, who was a cousin of the family. Then the rising action. He was a very close friend of the poet Milton. While a student at Cambridge, who wrote most famously the Paradise Lost poem. When Edward King was on his way back to Cambridge from Ireland, his ship sank off the Pembrokeshire coast in 1637. He was drowned, and in grief and honour of his friend, Milton wrote the eulogy Lycidias. Lycidias is considered to be the finest eulogy or elegiac poem in the English language. So this is Lycidias's high chair, and it dates back to the 1590s, prior to the castle, and so is a very unique and treasured item within the castle. The story doesn't take long. Stories don't have to be long, but they need the story mountain or the story arc as shown here: introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, evaluation, and then linking it to life. Just another point that, anybody who has studied English for A-level, for Leaving Cert in Ireland, would have come across Milton. Anybody who's studied English actually anywhere in the world would have heard of Milton. So there was a connection, there was a prior knowledge. Maybe they'd studied Paradise Lost. So it drew them in. That's something that they knew about before. What do tourists like and remember? And what is a memorable experience? Well, the literature gives us a great deal of information on and research on what makes the memorable tourist experience. The hedonism, the pleasure, novelty, something new and different, knowledge, the importance of knowledge, meaning, getting involved, local culture and refreshment. These are some of the terms from Kim et al. In 2011, 2014, and there's so many studies out there. So we tried to work out what were the memorable stories at Huntington and why were they memorable. So we started the tour in the porch and we went through the entrance hall. Then we went up the stairs, where the armor is shown that I mentioned earlier, and then up into the dining room. And the dining room has lots of portraits. It has that chair in the window there that I was speaking about a moment ago. And it has the family history on the stained glass window at the back. Then we went into the drawing room, which is a nice, bright, open room. And again, the family photos on the piano and the portraits on the wall. I'm linking the old and the new. From the drawing room into the conservatory and the various stories associated with that. Then into the tapestry room, which has Bedouin tapestries and tapestries from France and various other things. Then back along the corridor, down the stairs, into the kitchen, where all the old appliances were, and the original stove, etc. And then outside into the basement and temple, and then finish in the garden. So that was the tour choreography as such. And things are positioned in each room so that they can be talked about, and it gives the overall tour. So we asked people, what were the stories, and we gave each story a name. What were the stories that were most memorable, most popular, least popular, and what did they like about the objects? So, we named them and numbered them, and there were a total of 78 stories, but only 11 made it to the most popular stories. And we see that as we go through the various rooms, the most popular room was the dining room, where all the best stories were told. And in the drawing room, there was only one story. What it tells us there is we need to balance out and find more good stories in the drawing room. The kitchen also didn't stimulate the memory. So it balanced throughout when choreography. And, ask your tourists what they think of the tour, so that you know that you have this information. So what makes the memorable tourism experience? Through stories that create meaning, emotion, engage the senses, have a good storyscape, they absorb the person, they're genuine, and they educate and entertain. That's what we're looking for to do with our stories. There is no one set formula to doing this, but there is a number of ways to do it. And what you've got to do is find your own way. That's it. So we asked then people to give us a narrative of what they liked and what they didn't like, etc. And if you look, and you don't need to read the actual content there, but what they were talking about, the story, mental engagement, imagination, their personal states of mind, the sensescape, the sensorial interaction, nostalgia, the guide performance, mental engagement again, value, memorability, the characters, the storyscape, mental engagement as well. That's the third time. authentic objects, guide performance, again, movement, imagination, storyscape, etc. Okay, these are the things that we have extracted as being important for the tourists. So what do they do, guides and tourists do to co-create the experience? Well, the story types that we've talked about earlier are a progression in engagement, as this line shows down here. What do the guides need to do and what do tourists need to do? The guide needs to create interaction to engage the intention of the tourist. They need to facilitate involvement with props, with participation, so that they can actively get involved. They need to convey meaning and allow the tourist to relate and interpret what they're saying. They need to promote interest so that the tourist becomes mindful. They need to foster learning and allow tourists to integrate their own prior knowledge on the subject. They need to stimulate the emotions in order to develop the feelings within the tourist. They need to activate the imagination in order to allow tourists to visualize and dream. They need to enable immersion for the tourist to escape temporarily and advance enjoyment so that on personal reflection, the tourist feels they have appropriated pleasure. Okay, so it is the actions of all parties. The guide has a role to play, but the tourist has a role to play. And the tourist must be willing and able to engage at this level. There will be some tourists who don't want to engage, who are along for the ride, who don't want to get involved. So sharing our stories, just very briefly, the 6 P's of storytelling are integrate people, the characters, their stories, their lives, what happened to them, in short vignettes of different people. The plot, the flow or sequence of the story. Use the story arc or the story mountain. Use props to entertain and enhance understanding and allow participation. Place, staging and mapping your story escape so that you know what stories are going to be told where and have a balance throughout the tour. The delivery, the performance of the story, and painting pictures with your words using your whole body, you know, an embodied performance. Those 6 P's would be the content of a whole other presentation and another day's work. So, so this is a whirlwind around our research on Ireland's ancient East, which is the eastern part of Ireland that covers 5,000 years of history told through stories and landscape. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions later. Thank you. Goodbye.
Well, thank you, Jacqui, for this this great presentation. I hope that the delay and the technical problems we had at the beginning did not shadow the story, because the story was really impressive. You almost did a summary of a certified interpretive guide course. All the elements were there. It was a great example of how you can make a good storytelling and story sharing